Hi, welcome back to Bexhill West. I'm James. Now today's video is all about this double slip which I've put together from a British Finescale kit. The kit's brilliant. I've really enjoyed putting this thing together. Now you could see it here on my Jubilee Challenge layout challenge entry. This was always going to be a 1 in 8 slip and the kit is a 1 in 7. I've put it together. I really like it, I'd like to keep it. So I've massaged the geometry of everything going on here track wise to see if it would work, and I've made up some template 3D track just to kind of put it all together so I can sight along it, and I think that this will work. So this is going to stay as a permanent feature on here. Now the video is quite long, I'm afraid. I've tried to cover everything in as much detail as I possibly can because I know that some people watch these videos and find them useful. So hopefully there's enough detail if you're thinking of putting one of these together, whether this is in P4 but you might want a 001 or an EM, or even the N-gauge kits are very, very similar. So there we go, that's what today's all about. Thank you very much indeed for watching. So then, this is today's project. This is the British Finescale Fine Tracks 1 in 7 double slip kit. Now I'm really looking forward to putting this together. I've done one of the turnout kits from British Finescale before. They're excellent. This will be unusually for me, hopefully a really quick win. Normally everything I do takes 10 times longer than it would anybody else, but this should be a nice, quick and easy to put together thing. So we'll go through the contents of the kit in just a minute. Firstly, let's just mention this drawing here. This is the instruction sheet which I've downloaded from the website, and this shows everything I need to know to put this together. Now I'm going to say right off the top here, one of the things that I really like about these Fine Tracks kits is that they are simple. This drawing isn't muddled up with lots of terminology and specialist names of things. It literally just tells us what we need to know to build this thing. So if you've never built a piece of track before, you can easily put these Fine Tracks kits together. Everything you need to know to build it is here, but none of the other stuff. Now the other stuff's interesting to know about, and we'll talk about some of, you know, all the bits and pieces on here, what they're called, etc., as we go along. But the point is, if you've never built a piece of track before, everything we need to know is on here, and it should be fairly straightforward. So I'll get the bits out of the kit and we'll have a look. So hopefully you could see that this drawing, this downloadable drawing, is full size. This is obviously the timbering base. This is a 3D print and is exceptional quality. Now Wayne at British Finescale obviously knows his stuff. This is not a sort of a standard sort of consumer grade print. It's obviously got a very, very good quality machine, and I believe he has a special mixture for the resin that this is printed with. So this track base has got the flex it requires. It's not brittle, it's nice. The detail is excellent. Okay, so that's that. We've got the other bits and pieces. I won't go through all of these bits because we'll do that as we put the thing together. Basically everything we need here is ready to go, and probably if you've never built a piece of track before, the thing that's probably the most daunting is sorting out the V's, or the common crossings. So we've got common crossings at this end, here and here, and we've got obtuse crossing V's just here. And within the kit, all the parts are supplied pre-machined, so there's no complicated filing. You don't need to get extra jigs. Let's see if I can get one of these out. The angles that we need are all machined on the end. I'll bring you in close and show you those in just a moment. So we'll be able to just thread the rails in and assemble this fairly quickly. Now what we will need to do is cut some of these rails to length. That'll be a kind of a straight 90-degree cut, and for that I'm going to use a pair of Juron track cutters. These things are excellent. I'll put a link in the video description to get this kind of exact pair. These are the ones I'd recommend. They are absolutely wonderful. With these, and if you cut carefully, there'll be very little cleanup to do. Where we do need to clean up, then I'll use a file. There we go, it's one of my files. So we'll just use a file, just tidy the ends, and there'll be a little bit of preparation that we need to do on the ends of the rails before we slide them into the timbering base. I'll cover all of that as we go along. Now the first rails that we're going to fit to this kit are these little rails here, which run into the K-crossing or the obtuse V, and we're just going to these little short ones from here to here, and there's an insulated joint here against the closure rail, which we'll deal with in a minute. So what we need to do is offer our rail up to the drawing. It's very important that we get this just right, and we can measure off of the drawing directly the length of the rail that we require. So in this case I'm going to cut that rail where I've marked it just there. Now when it comes to marking and cutting these rails, it's very important that we consider the cross-sectional shape of the ball head rail. So I don't know if I don't know if the camera's going to be any good at showing you this. I might get a separate close-up in just a moment. Here are the rails that we're going to cut, and you can see they have the pre-machined angle on the end of the blades. Now the head of ball head rail is slightly deeper than the foot, so clearly it's handed, it sits one way up. The smaller section sits obviously at the bottom, so we need to look very carefully at these rails because they're handed. That is to say, the angle of the machining of this V on the end of the rail is handed relative to the head and the foot of the rail. So we need to make sure that when we mark out and cut and measure and what have you, that we're doing so with the head of the rail at the top. Also, if we cut one of these the wrong way round, we're likely to damage the chairs on the printed base as we thread them in, because if we try to thread them upside down, we'll try to be pushing a fatter section through the little chairs, you know, fatter than it was designed to cope with. So hopefully that's pretty clear. So that's the number one thing to check every time we have to cut a piece of rail, is just check that that's the head. I always make a point of marking the rail on the head, and then when I come to cut it, I double check that that mark once again is on the head. And every so often I get it wrong, because if you've got eyesight like mine, you can't always see the difference between the head and the foot. Anyway, having marked this one out, I'm happy with that. I'm going to cut it with my track cutters. Now I'm going to be very careful cutting this, because sometimes the bit you're cutting pings off, so I'm just going to support that and make the cut. Hopefully you can see I've left a little bit of extra material on the end of the rail, so I can file that to size. Now I'm using this little vise to hold my material, and I've just set it so that I can file up to the jaws of the vise to give me a nice square end. This is a hardened vise jaw, so I won't damage the actual vise, but it's a handy way of getting the ends of these done nicely. Now hopefully you could see I've got the first one of these rails in place. That was all fairly straightforward. I'll install the second one, but something to bear in mind here is we've got to start sliding this through the chairs some way over here on the right hand side. We've got to come in where the slide chairs are, which is here, and push that rail forward. So the next up is these little check rails. These check rails need to have a small bend, very slight bend put in them. So I've used the offcut from the wing rails that I've just been chopping up, and I've laid that onto my drawing, and hopefully you can see there's a little black dot just there, and that's where I'm going to form the bend. Now I'm going to make the bend first before I cut this to length, and this is actually going to be made in 2 halves. We'll talk about why it's done in 2 halves a little bit later on, but let's form that bend first before I cut it to length, because it'll make the whole process a lot easier. And all I'm going to do is get that piece of rail in the jaws of my file nice and square, and then if I refocus the camera, there we go, something like that. Make sure it's nice and square. There we go, something like that. We're going to make sure it's nice and square in the jaws of my pliers, and then I'm going to just form that bend. Now I'm actually going to, what I would normally do is put that against the edge of the bench or something and try and get that bend nice and square, but that's not too bad. Now I think that's bent a bit too much. That's the way I always like to do it. And then what I do is I just reset the material, squeeze the pliers back again just to take some of that overbending out, and usually that gives me an angle that's about right. But I'll offer this up to the drawing now, we'll have a look, and if necessary I'll squeeze that a little bit more just to close that down a tad further. Yeah, it's not too bad. I might just tweak it a little more. Yep, that's overbent it, so I'll straighten it again. That's now not too bad. So having done that, I can now mark the length at which I want to cut it, and I can cut that the same way as I did with those Xuron cutters. There we go, that's not bad, and I'll cut that to length now in the same way as I did with all the others, the little wing, there we go, that's not bad. I'll cut that in the same way as I cut the other rails using the Xuron cutters, and then filing the end of the rail square. Now here's a little tip. I filed the end of that square. It doesn't look too bad, but what I'd like to do is just run my fingernail across the edges that I've cut, and often you'll feel a very small burr, so it's very important that we remove those burrs, and I'll just use a little bit of emery board for that. Just a couple of passes is generally sufficient. If we leave those burrs on the rail head and the rail foot, and importantly on the web of the rail, then when we slide it into the plastic chairs it will catch, and it's likely to break those chairs. So it just takes a moment to remove those burrs. Obviously try to avoid scratching the head of the rail. And generally speaking, you can feel when it's properly prepared. It wouldn't hurt just to gently chamfer, and again not by much, the web just to take that edge off, so we're certain it's all cleaned up. That rail will then slide into place nicely and it won't snag on any chairs. Okay, so I've rushed ahead a little bit here and I've fitted the check rails to the left hand side of the slip. And really I've noticed a mistake. Now I could have, my mistake I might add, I could add that I could just edit it out, but I think I'll leave my mistake in just as anybody who wants to follow these instructions, it might help them if they make a similar mistake. So on the, I believe the 00 and the EM versions of this kit, these check rails are, I believe, 3D printed. However, for the P4 version, these are folded up metal rails, which is great. The mistake I made is that it is necessary to flex the plastic timbering base slightly to slide those in. And of course you can't flex it currently because I've already pre-fitted these. So what I'm going to do is remove these two rails that I fitted previously, and then I'll show you the flexing of the turnout base to slide these check rails in. It's not really a mistake, it's not the end of the world, I've not damaged anything. I think if I was going to build a second one of these, I'd probably pre-make all of these components in advance. So I'm just going to slide those out. So that's obviously just the reverse of putting them in. I'm sorry, my thumb was in the way there. It's difficult to do this and get everything on camera without obscuring things. And I don't want to damage what I'm doing for the sake of making a clearer video. You know, don't want to see you, or you to see me making a mistake which could have been avoided. So let's slide those back. So if I turn this around, we need to flex the base slightly to allow us the clearance to slide those rails in. I'll move the camera, I'll show you me doing it and hopefully it'll make a bit more sense. But there we go. So let's fit those now. So hopefully you can see what I'm doing here now. What I want to do is slide this check rail, which I've got in my tweezers here, and this needs to end up just here. And by flexing this base down, that allows me to slide this into the appropriate chairs. So I think that needs to go in there. Excuse me, I might just obscure this slightly. Let me get it started. Okay, so you can see that's now threaded in there, and I should be able to push that forward. And because this base is flexing down, that allows me to get that rail in and avoid the chair below it. So that just slides straight in. So then, with little more than very basic tools, a pair of track cutters, a file, an emery board and a pair of tweezers, we've assembled one of the most complex bits of sort of turnout geometry there is, and so far so good. Next job is to fit the switch rails, which I'm quite looking forward to doing. So I'll get those out of the packet, we'll cut those to length, they just slide in. That should be a nice straightforward job. Now then, my camera battery died, so whilst that was charging up, I've gone ahead and I've fitted most of the switch rails. Now that's a very simple job. I just got the switch rails out of their little packet, and it's just a case of offering them up to the drawing, the rail lengths. One end, as with the V's, is pre-machined, so obviously we've got to orientate it the right way round, make sure the head is at the top, and there we go, just mark it. I cut it to length, filed the end square, and then as before, really important this, just make sure that those cut ends are deburred. It isn't necessary to file a V shape to sort of thread them on nicely. If you get all of those burrs off and that's nice and properly prepared, I found that the rail does just slide in. So let's fit this last one. Hang on, I'll change my glasses. Oh, that's better. So, and again, it may help just to flex the timbering base down slightly. That will push straight in, just as with the other rails. Slide in quite straightforwardly. There we go, something like that. Oh, I've got to push it on just a touch more. That's it. So the next job will be to fit the closure rails. There's 4 of them, 2 on each side, which come from the obtuse crossing in the centre to the common crossings, or frogs, whatever you want to call them, on the outboard ends of this slip. Same as before, very, very simple. Using the rail supplied, measure off the lengths we need from the drawings, cut the end square and clean them up. Now, the drawing shows that on each end of the closure rail we need an insulated joint. That's so that this thing will work electrically. And the sort of leaves us up to our own devices, really, the kit, in terms of how we choose to insulate that joint, and people will have different preferred methods. The kit says that we should secure all the rails with a few drops of super glue on various chairs. When it's completed, that will probably we could just leave a gap and super glue the rails in. That will probably be just fine. I'm going to use these exacta scale sort of insulating fish platey things, simply because I like them. It's nice to have the, I don't know if the camera will focus on it or not, but it's nice to have the visible bolt detail. So they're quite nice. Another alternative that I have used with code 75 bullhead rail, which is what we're using here, so this would be the same for 00 or EM, P4, etc., is I've used these are N-gauge, I think code 55 insulating rail joiners. These do work, actually. They're not perfect fit, but they do work. So that might be another option that you might want to consider. So the challenge, of course, is getting these tiny little things on, and I've had a bit of a hot and cold relationship with these things in the past. They either work or they don't. Quite often they split in 2. So I'm using this very simple cobbled together tool to, let me get my knife, fit the fish plate where we need it. Something like that. So I say these things can be very fiddly to fit. Right, there we go. There's one. Here's my closure rail that I've previously prepared, and now we're going to slide this in. And just as before, it helps to flex this timbering base slightly so that we can get that rail in. Now I'm going to just pick this up and hold it up to my eye so I can see what I'm doing. Apologies, this will go out of focus, I'm sure. There we go, so that started it off, and I can now slide that in quite straightforwardly. And with a little bit of luck, that'll slide into that fish plate. Oh, look at that, first go. Right, that's good. Aha, success. So we've got all 4 closure rails are now fitted, and at this point we can have a little play. Well, I'm amazed. That's really smooth. Right, that's better. So we've got the centre of the slip all done. The next job is the common crossing and the wing rails. These wing rails, in sort of real life, these are formed from one piece of rail, and the bend, which is indicated by a blue line here on the drawing, and that's called the knuckle bend, and it has a kind of a radius to it. And that's quite critical. If we were building this turnout from scratch by hand, the location of that knuckle and the radius and everything is all quite crucial to getting this thing to work smoothly, particularly with P4 track. Now, with a bent one-piece rail, it would be impossible to slide it into the timbering base. It would damage the chairs. So this British Finescale kit splits each of these rails in two at that blue line. So what we need to do is cut a piece of rail for here, a piece of rail for here, and this red dotted line indicates where the flare is on the end of that rail. So there's a subtle bend there, it kind of opens up. So what we need to do is cut those bits of rail cut, and that should be all straightforward. So for example, that is one of my pieces there, and again this will be an insulated joint. So I'm going to see if I can get this into here, again using one of those X-Acto scale fish plates which drive me nuts. So let's have a go and see how I do. Now then, sliding this piece of rail in is another one of those jobs where we need to just gently flex the printed base back enough to allow that piece of rail to slide in. And again, this is difficult to do for me at this angle, so I might lay that, well now that's in, I can lay that flat. And there we go, there's our little piece of rail in. Again, another one of those fish plates which really does make this thing look rather splendid. So I need to work around, I've got 3 more of these short pieces to do first. I'll do those just because it allows me to flex this base, and then I'll get on and I'll do the flared part of the wing rails. So I haven't fitted that one, I won't show you fitting all the other bits because we'll be here all day. So next job is to fit the second half of these wing rails, and you can see I've pre-fitted them here. If I turn the slip around, you can see here I'm still yet to fit them. Now let's bring the camera out a little bit. You'll see that I've pre-made them. Again, just taking my measurements from the drawing. So they're pre-made and I can just slip them in. And again, we're going to have to do that trick of bending this timbering base a little bit just so that they will slide in. There we go, there's one. Let's get the second one in. There we go. Next up we'll have a go at the check rails, and again simply a case of marking up the rail. Again, I'm double checking to make sure that I'm always marking the head. That way it'll help me to orientate the rail correctly when I come to slide it into place. Permanent pen, really handy. Get one with a fine tip. There we go. So I'll make 4 of these up, dress the ends. I'll put the bends in with my pliers. I'll show you how I'm going to do that in just a minute, and then we'll get those fitted. So then, forming those bends, I've got the piece of rail in my pliers. I've got the little bend mark set. Now my bench, I've got this little bench block here, and that's quite a handy way of bending those. You could do it over the corner of a table or whatever you've got, block of wood. I find that quite a handy way of doing it. And again, as I mentioned earlier, I tend to always over bend these, and then I squeeze them, and kind of experience has now taught me how much to squeeze them by, and generally if they look right to my eye, they almost always are. But I'll now offer this up to the drawing, and I'll double check that it's to the right shape, and then we can slide them in. So I've got 3 more to do. I'll do those and then we'll fit them. And here we go. Here's one of the rails all bent up against the drawing. It's a perfect match. So what I'll do is I'll just dress those ends of the rail now, and we'll be able to slide it onto the job. Now, I mentioned these cutters I've been using. They are excellent, but if I had one criticism, and it's not really a criticism of the tool, it's a criticism of the fact I'm using a shearing type tool to cut these things rather than like a saw blade or something. But when you snip the end of the rail, it can have the effect of slightly squeezing up the web and causing the web of the rail to fatten ever so slightly. So where's my little emery board? Here we go. When I clean these things up, I always pay very close attention to cleaning that centre of that web, and it's very easy to overlook any sort of swelling that may have occurred there, but I really advise spending time, especially on the web. Make sure that's nice and square and true, because then these things will push through the chairs much more easily. So far I've not broken a single chair. Let's hope I carry on that way, but I think one of the reasons for it is because I do pay very, very special attention to the ends of the rails. So I've fitted the check rails to this end of the slip, and I've got one of them fitted here, so there's just one more left to fit. Let's have a go at that now. So it just slides in. I realise I put my hand in the way. Sorry, you can't see what I'm doing. I'll try and do this left-handed. Pretty good. I'm trying to do this very gently. There we go. So we've got almost all of the difficult bits now complete. We've just got the common crossing rails, the point rail and the splice rail to fit on each end, and the 2 stock rails, and then this thing's going to be pretty good for testing. In fact, I think I'll do the stock rails next, because that'll be quite a pleasing little job. So I'm going to leave these stock rails slightly over length to begin with, because I may choose to trim them later, but for now let's just feed in what we've got. I can't believe this is as easy as this. This is really this is brilliant. This is a double slip. This thing's supposed to be very, very hard to build. You know, if we were doing this with traditional methods, but they're not hard to build, but they're time consuming and require great accuracy. So this is quite a joy just to thread the rail in, like nothing to worry about, just focus on the joy of getting a job finished. There we go. That's looking really, really nice. Now we've got this far, the final stages really are a bit of an anticlimax. There's nothing more complex than sliding 2 bits of pre-machined rail in. So the first one that goes in is our point rail, and the next one is the splice rail, and again these are all pre-machined. I've not done anything to this. We just slide it in, and there we go. That is our double slip, almost complete, but not completely complete. Let's just run something across there. This is nice, really nice. There's still another job to do, and that is to fit the tie bars which are going to operate the switches and make this thing work. So now our next exciting job is to fit the tie bars which are going to switch the switches back and forth, and the instructions say that they should be fitted much earlier in the process, and certainly before fitting the stock rails, but I got carried away with myself and ignored the instructions, or rather I forgot about them. To be honest with you, I read the instructions yesterday and didn't check them again today because my broadband's not working. I read them online. Those of you who watched my last video will know that I've been having ongoing issues with the broadband. But anyway, I've pulled the rails back out, put the tie bar in, and have fitted up that tie bar this end. So let's have a look at what's involved with the other end. I've got the tie bar inserted there, and then we've got these fine pins with a kind of mushroom head on one end, and they insert from the underside, just push through, very straightforward. And once they're pushed through, they get bent over. What I'm going to do is just trim them to length first, and they want to be sort of a couple of millimetres above the rail head before you bend them. Or you could bend them first, I suppose, wouldn't matter. Let's just nip those off. Not sure what these are made of, but they're quite a soft material, solders very nicely, and we just bend them over at 90 degrees. I'm going to use my handle of my tweezers, which seems to have been my preferred tool today. I've used the handle more than I've used the actual tweezer part, but there we go. Yes. Make sure that's pushed up from underneath. Bend it over. So there are 4 of those to pop in. Let's do all 4 of them before I carry on. So there we go, we've got those 4 little pins popped in place and folded over, and these need to solder to the ends of our switches. So to do that, the kit comes with some neat little spacer blocks. Now these spacer blocks will be different sizes depending on which gauge you're using, because clearly different gauges have different tolerances for this sort of thing. So I'm going to fit the P4 block here. There we go, that's going to sit in there something like that, and we need to solder that little wire into there. So let's have a go at that. Now we also want to keep the head of the rail, we want the rail head here to be flush with the stock rail. Mine is sitting nicely. What we could do is, if it was a problem, is get in there with a pair of tweezers, or better still, bear with me a second. Could use one of these little hair grips. These are good for all sorts of little jobs, so I'm going to just feed that in. I don't think I need it here, but let's... There we go. That's pretty good. Okay, that's my first soldered connection. The next spacer block. There we go. So the other sides can now be soldered, butted up nice and firm with the rail. There we have it, no fuss. Working switches. So here's the double slip completed, ready for its first proper wagon test. So here we go. Now, running a wagon with a finger on the top is a recipe for derailing it in P4, but there we go, that seems to have worked. Let's try changing things around. So let's change that switch over, and yeah, we'll keep that one the same. That seems pretty good. Let's try something else. Let's throw this set of switches across. So now we should be able to come down here. All seems pretty good. And now I'm going to throw this set of switches. And we'll throw this one back. See what happens now. Pretty good. I'm pleased with that. So there we have it, one very reliable double slip. I'm really pleased with this. Next time I'll have it wired up and you'll be able to see it working. We'll have some trains running in the next episode, and there's a big update coming with the turntable. That's all kind of complete, and in fact that turntable controller system, which regular viewers will remember, will be very shortly on sale. So that will all the details of that will be in episode 2 of season 3. So thanks for watching, stay tuned.